All right, Bones, here we go. You ready? Here's another piece of weather that you need to know about. All about air masses. That's right. Here we go. Let's go. All right, we're talking about air masses today. Air masses are cool and they're pretty easy to understand, so you should be able to get this pretty quick. An air mass is simply what it says. It's a big air mass. It is a big bubble of air. Picture a big bubble, like a tennis bubble. I'm a tennis coach, so I play a lot of tennis and tennis bubbles. An air mass is a big bubble of air that moves across the country. Okay, it moves from California over to New York, moves from west to east. Okay, along with the wind patterns of the world, and it carries a certain kind of air with it for a couple days. So picture a big dome or a big bubble of air and weather moving across the country. Okay, this controls the weather for a few days at a time. So that's why we get a few days of nice weather, and then we'll get a couple days of a day or two of bad weather. Then we'll get a couple days of nice weather, and then we'll get a day or two of bad weather because it goes in cycles. Okay. Now, the thing about air masses is that it actually picks up the characteristics of weather from where it's formed. Okay, so if it forms in cold weather, then the air inside the bubble is going to be cold. If it forms in moist air, then the air inside the bubble is going to be moist and have a lot of water in it. So there's different combinations that we can look at, but it's really simple to understand. Okay, so air masses, wherever they develop, they pick up those characteristics of weather, and it stays in that bubble as it moves across the country. So, like I said, let's say an air mass forms above the Pacific Ocean. Okay, when it forms above the Pacific Ocean, that means water is going to evaporate up into the air mass, and you're going to have moist air. Okay, so that means over water. Over water, when it develops, means that you're going to have wet or moist air. If it forms over land, okay, let's say an air mass forms over Canada, okay, but over the land part of Canada, that means the air is going to be dry because there's no water going up into the air. The air is just formed this little bubble and is very dry air. Okay. If it forms in a cold area, we'll go back to Canada again. Let's say the air mass forms over Alaska. And it's just a cold area. It's very high in latitude where the air mass forms. That means that it's going to be cold air. All right. And if it forms more of in a tropical area or a warm weather area, maybe Mexico, or Brazil or somewhere, even if we're talking about the southern hemisphere, then it's going to be a warm air mass. Okay, so when it forms over water, it's going to be moist air. When it forms over land, it's going to be dry air. When it forms in a cold place, it's going to be cold air, and when it forms in a warm place, it's going to be warm air. Bones just whispered in my ear. It ain't rocket science. All right, so the characteristics go where in the air mass of where it forms. All right, very simple to understand. So now, time to fancy it up a little bit. All right, Bones, let's fancy it up. Time to name the air masses. And as long as you can keep these names straight, this is going to be really, really simple to understand, okay? Air masses are named after the region where they were formed. But we're going to change the words around a little bit. Instead of saying wet air, okay, or moist air, what we're going to say is that's maritime air, which means moist, okay? Instead of using the word cold, we're going to use the word polar, all right? So we're just going to change the words around a little bit. And here's the symbols for each of the four, okay, main air masses. So this little m, capital P, and this is weird. You always do a little first letter and a capital second letter for abbreviating your air masses. The word maritime means moist. The word polar means cold. Okay, so maritime means it's going to be wet air. It must have formed over water. Okay, maritime, moist. The M's go together. Polar, I think polar bears. You think polar bears? I always think polar bears. I love polar bears. They live in cold weather. So polar means cold. Okay, so maritime polar, okay, is a moist, cold air mass. It's going to bring wet, cold air. All right, maybe it will snow. I don't know. All right, so then we also have maritime tropical. Maritime still means moist. That means it had to have formed over an ocean or something like that. But now it's happening in a tropical region. Tropical means warm. Okay, think of a tropical vacation. Nice warm weather, sitting out on the beach. Tropical means warm. So maritime, moist, tropical, warm. So it's a maritime tropical air mass. So it probably formed over the ocean somewhere, but closer to the equator. Then we have the word continental. Okay, continental, think of the word continent, over land. that's going to stand for the word dry. So think of it as the air mass formed over a continent. It's dry over a continent because it's made of land, so that means dry, okay? Continental polar, there's our word polar again, that just means cold. So continental polar, okay, is abbreviated with a little c, capital P. Then we have continental tropical. Again, continental means dry because it was formed over land. Tropical meaning warm. Think of a tropical beach on vacation. So we've got 4 main air masses that you have to remember. Maritime polar, maritime tropical, continental polar, continental tropical. Now, this is not something you necessarily have to memorize. What you just have to do is piece the words together. Just remember, maritime means moist or wet air. Continental means dry. Okay? Polar means cold. Tropical means warm. So no matter how I put the words together in whatever combination, you should be able to know what kind of weather is associated with that air mass or that air bubble as it travels over you. Okay? All right. So let's take a look. This is what I mean. All right. So some common places where air masses form. So take a look here. This is what I was explaining earlier. So maritime means it was formed over water. So let's say here's an air mass here. It's forming over water. Maritime. That means it's going to be wet air. Okay. Now it's up here forming next to Alaska. It's cold up there. That means polar. So this is a maritime polar air mass. That means wet, cold air is going to come into our country for a couple days. Down here, okay, it's forming over the ocean, but it's more closer to the equator. Maritime tropical, okay? Wet air, but it's going to be warm air. So wet, warm air is going to be moving into our area. So maritime polar, maritime tropical. Okay, we're going to come over to the right side of the map now. We're going to stick with the maritime. Maritime, okay, maritime means formed over water, wet air, and it's pretty far north. It's up near Greenland and Iceland. That's a polar climate. So maritime polar, here's a cold, moist air mass here. Maritime tropical, okay, formed over the Gulf of Mexico. Formed over water, it's wet. Formed in a tropical area, it's warm. So wet, warm air, okay, that would come up the coast, all right? So these are your maritime air masses. In the middle here, let's say the air mass formed over land, okay? Notice there's no water that is forming over, so it's not a lot of moisture going to go up into that air mass because it's not a lot of air go into that bubble. So we say, what's the word for dry? Continental. All right, and look, it's forming over a continent. It's forming over a continent. So we've got continental polar. Okay, so that's going to be dry air, and polar means cold. So dry, cold. So this is kind of the area where a continental polar air mass would form. And here's continental tropical. Again, it formed over a continent, continental, which means it's going to be dry, but it formed in a warmer climate, tropical. We also have this continental Arctic. That just means it's going to be dry. And Arctic, what do you think Arctic means? Really, really cold. Okay? You don't see that one as much. You stick with the 4 main ones and you should be okay. All right? So again, an air mass is a bubble of air that takes on the characteristics of weather of where it was formed as it crosses our country over a couple days, and you have that type of weather for a few days at a time. Okay? Very simple to understand. Air masses. Got it, Bones? All right.